Hello, my name's Devin Iimoto. I'm a professor of chemistry and I'm starting my 25th year at Whittier College. The reason that I'm here talking to you about Angels in America is because I do have an interest in the disease AIDS. I teach a course on AIDS that is taught maybe once every other year. I've had friends that have died from the disease. I have friends that are living with HIV currently. And so I know a little bit about the disease and how it interfaces with the play. I want to emphasize the medical, biological aspects of the disease, but I think it's important to put this play in the context of what was going on in the US surrounding AIDS in the mid-1980s. The play, of course, is set at the end of 1985 and goes through the early part of 1986. To know that the first documented case of someone with AIDS in the world was in 1981. Even though it is believed that people probably had the disease probably as early as the late 70s and stuff in the US and so forth. The cause of AIDS, the virus HIV, was discovered by Luc Montagnier, who, by the way, spoke here at Whittier College a few years ago, and Robert Gallo. They announced their findings in 1984. So right before the play was set. In terms of diagnosing whether someone was infected with HIV, the tests came out in 1985, so right about the time of this play. AZT, which the play talks about as an experimental treatment for the disease, was actually officially approved by the FDA in 1987, so a couple years after this play is set. There was a lot of fear associated with the disease in the mid-1980s. There was no cure for the disease, and some thought that the death rate was 100%. Even though certain routes of transmission had been identified by that point, including transmission through sexual contact and bodily fluids, injection drug use, hemophiliacs, and mother-to-child transmission in childbirth and so forth, it was still not clear whether other routes of transmission were possible or not. And so again, it was the fear of the unknown. When AIDS came out, it primarily infected men in the gay community, and then it spread out beyond that. And basically at that time, it brought out a lot of animosity against people who were gay. A well-known preacher, Jerry Falwell, actually said publicly on TV that AIDS was God's punishment on homosexuals. If you read in the early parts of the play, you have two characters, you have Pryor and you have Louis as partner. And it was actually not uncommon during that time period for someone who had AIDS for either their partner or their friends to abandon them. Pryor is 31 years old, and a lot of men at that time who were infected with HIV and had AIDS were in that age range, in their 20s and 30s, and other people that they were friends with in that age range don't necessarily know how to deal with someone that's dying. The other character who has the disease in the play, Roy, he's diagnosed in November and he dies by February. And that seems like a very short time period for someone to die from disease. But again, back in the 80s, that was not uncommon. That in fact, the average time from diagnosis to death during that time was about 2 years. It is believed that strain of HIV was particularly more virulent than it is now. People can now expect to live 10, 15 years, maybe even more, infected with HIV, but back then, that was not the case. His Dr. Henry comes to him and says, "Oh, well, you have AIDS," and he's like, "Oh, you must be mistaken, I don't have AIDS, I have cancer," right? And he threatens the doctor that if he says that again, he's gonna sue him or do something to him. And again, because of the situation, there were a lot of people that didn't want other people to know that they were gay. During the 80s, I volunteered for an AIDS organization in San Diego, and I remember visiting with a family a few times. This woman's husband had AIDS, and I remember being there this one time where she had a family friend there. I think I mentioned AIDS somewhere in the conversation, and she took me out of the room and said, "Do not say that word in the presence of other people," because she did not want her friends to know that he had AIDS, that basically what they were telling their friends was that he had cancer. The title of the book, Angels in America, even though there were some people that did abandon people with AIDS, there were a lot of people, particularly the gay community had to come together as a community to support people with the disease. I mean, it was pretty much life or death, so to speak. There's very little support for people with AIDS at that time, and so there were a lot of different organizations that were founded to provide that care and support for people with AIDS, including here in Los Angeles, AIDS Project Los Angeles, and those provided a lot of support with people with the disease. And while those organizations are not mentioned in the play, what you see is individual people kind of rising above the fray and really helping out in different ways.